They say if you follow the creek deep enough into the holler, past where the hemlocks block out the sun, you might hear a sound like a muffled sob. Most folks think it's just the wind in the gap, but in these hills we know better. We know the story of a creature so ashamed of its own skin that it'll dissolve into a pool of its own tears rather than let you see it.
Hi, I'm Beth, and I've spent the past few weeks rewriting the old fairy tale The Frog Prince to fit in the world I know, the foothills of Appalachia. In place of a royal pond, we're headed into the deep hemlocks to meet the most lonesome of creatures in Appalachian folklore, the Squonk. While you listen, we'll hike through Board State Nature Preserve. Between the sandstone gorge, the hemlocks, and the waterfall, it feels like the exact magical place a squonk would hide. If the world feels a little bit too loud today, I'm glad you found your way here. So settle in, there's no rush. Let's begin.
The Frog Prince, Appalachian Edition. Long ago, when the magic in these mountains was as plain as the morning sun, there lived a blacksmith up on the ridge. His daughters were all of a fine character, but Sadie, the youngest, was so beautiful that the sun itself, which has seen the wild world over, would pause to marvel whenever its light fell across her face. Now the blacksmith was a solemn man who never laughed nor cried. They said he had forged 3 iron bands around his heart, shielding himself from the world that was too harsh to walk through unprotected. He hammered his anvil from dawn until dusk, and it rang with a steady, joyless rhythm. He was not a cruel man, but he was a silent one, and while his family tried to bring him joy, he kept his own heart carefully shuttered against it. Sadie, however, sparkled with life. Her favorite treasure was her mother's cameo brooch, carved from shell and gold, an heirloom passed down the generations that she was permitted to wear only on the most special of days. Most days were not special, filled with chores and responsibilities, but when the stillness of the afternoon gave her leave, she would secretly pin that cameo to her bodice to make the dull days shine a little brighter. On the afternoons that turned heavy with heat, Sadie would slip away from the farmhouse and run toward the deep forest that shaded the creek. Beneath the hemlocks, where the air stayed cool as a cellar and the moss grew thick as a quilt, she would sit by the water's edge. There, she had a habit of watching her own reflection in the running stream, admiring the way the gold of her mother's cameo caught the little flickers of light that peeked through the canopy. On this particularly hot afternoon, the woods felt different. Sadie noticed a tiny new stream where there had been none before, a vein of water cutting through the forest floor. It didn't bubble or hum like the creek she knew. Instead, it made a strange, rhythmic sound, like a low and weary sob. Ignoring the prickle of unease at the back of her neck, Sadie followed the weeping water straight through a dense thicket of rhododendron and into a small hidden clearing. There, the little stream led right up to the strangest little creature. It was a miserable, warty thing with skin that sagged like wet wool and eyes that overflowed with thick, heavy tears, so many tears that they fed that little stream. For a heartbeat, Sadie and the wrinkly, warty beast simply stared at one another. Then, in a split second, the creature let out a shuddering gasp and dissolved before her very eyes, turning into a bubbling, saltwater puddle in the mud. This startled Sadie so greatly that she jerked back and stumbled to the ground. Her cameo went flying and hit the center of that murky, shifting puddle. With a soft plip, the cameo vanished, and the dark, hungry earth swallowed it whole, leaving nothing behind but the puddle of tears and sorrow. The peace and quiet of the hemlock forest was shattered by the girl's rising wail. She collapsed into the damp earth, heedless of the mud staining her skirts, and cried for her mother's lost treasure. Her sobs, sharp, desperate, and loud, rang out across the ridge, outdoing any sobs that had drawn her there in the first place. But then the mud near her knees began to bubble. Strange slurps, gurgles, and glugs joined Sadie's wails. The mud was sliding and knitting itself together. Sadie's sobs hitched. She watched as the puddle thickened, bulging into a hunched, warty back and a heavy, sorrowful head. The creature had returned. He looked even more miserable than before, his skin hanging in wet, gloopy folds, his eyes overflowing with a never-ending stream of tears. "You," he wheezed, "you sound just like I do. Why would someone as beautiful as you have something to wail about?" Sadie wiped her face with a muddy sleeve, too shocked to be afraid. "I lost it," she choked out. "My mother's brooch. It belonged to my great-great-granny, and I wasn't supposed to be wearing it." The creature peered into the mud. He pressed his webbed hand into the soil, and the earth yielded like soft wax. When he drew his hand back, the brooch gleamed, untouched by the muck. He showed it to her, but he didn't release it. "I am a squonk," he croaked, his gaze fixed on her with a strange, hungry intensity. "I'm condemned to hide in these hemlocks, too ugly to be seen. Truth be told, I can't even stand the sight of myself. If I give this back," he offered, his voice trembling with desperate hope, "you must visit me here every afternoon. You will listen to my story, and you will stay long enough that I might forget what I look like while I look at you." Sadie didn't take time to consider. She thought only of her mother's cameo brooch. "Sure, I can do that." She rashly snatched it from his grip. "I promise." Sadie bolted from the hemlock grove, returning home as fast as her legs would take her. Once back at the farmhouse, she quickly returned the cameo to its rightful place and changed for dinner. By the time the sun had dipped behind the ridge, the promise had slipped from her mind as easily as mountain mist. Truth be told, she was so relieved to have regained the brooch that she didn't give the squonk another thought. So, that first afternoon, Sadie did not remember to go to the woods. She stayed on the farmhouse porch, helping her sisters shell peas. As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, a low, rhythmic sound drifted up from the forest edge. A weary, broken sob. It was the same sound she heard in the hemlocks. Sadie's hands stilled, her skin prickling with a sudden sharp cold. She glanced toward the trees, expecting to see the warty, sagging shape of the little beast, but the shadows were empty. Surely it was just the wind. Yet, for the rest of the evening, she kept her back to the forest, unable to shake the feeling that something with weeping eyes was watching her from the dark. The next morning, as Sadie knelt in the cool, damp dark of the spring house to skim the cream, she heard it. A low, rhythmic sobbing. Squeezed between the buttercrocks and the stone walls sat the squonk. His sagging, warty skin was streaked with fresh, heavy tears that pooled on the flagstone floor. Sadie jumped, nearly tipping the cream pitcher. "Good heavens," she hissed, trying to keep her voice down so her sisters wouldn't hear. "Have you lost your marbles? You can't just be sitting here in our spring house." The creature looked up, his expression one of pure, miserable confusion. "You promised to listen to my story," he wheezed, a fresh tear sliding down his snout. "And the hours grew so long and the forest grew so lonely that I simply followed the scent of your absence." "My absence has a scent?" Sadie whispered, frantically trying to shoo him toward the door with her apron. "It smells like skipped promises," he sobbed. He didn't budge. He just hunched further into the corner, his skin rippling like a disturbed pond, and started his story. "It all began with my vanity, Sadie, on a day just as bright as the one where you found me." "Wait!" Sadie grabbed his arm, ignoring the cold, clammy texture of his hide, and yanked him toward the door. "Not here. If my father finds your crying mess, he'll toss you straight into the forge." The Squonk's eyes widened into saucers. With a pathetic sploosh, he dissolved into a puddle of salty tears, leaving Sadie standing alone in the damp silence of the spring house. Certain that the Squonk had vanished for good, Sadie didn't bother with her promise that afternoon, nor the next. But the following morning, when she went down into the dark of the root cellar to sort through the winter's last potatoes, soft, rhythmic sobs again greeted her. There he was, huddled behind a crate of shriveled apples, his warty skin pale in the dim light. "You didn't come visit me, Sadie," he whined, his voice trembling with a petulant, high-pitched quiver. "You gave your word. My story's burning a hole in my chest, and you'd rather come count potatoes." He drew a breath, his throat swelling, and let out a wail that sounded like the shriek of a tea kettle left too long on a stoked fire. "Hush!" Sadie hissed, jumping over a pile of sacks. "You're going to get us both caught. Do you have any idea how much noise you're making?" "I'm making exactly the amount of noise a forgotten promise deserves," he blubbered, his eyes bulging as he prepped for another shriek. "If you don't stop that caterwauling right this instant," Sadie threatened, grabbing a heavy potato sack, "I'm going to—" But before she could finish, the cellar door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and her father's heavy, rhythmic boot steps began to descend. In a blink, the Squonk gave a shuddering gasp, dissolved into a puddle of salt water, and soaked right through the dirt floor. Sadie stood alone in the dark, clutching the sack, her heart hammering as her father's shadow fell across the stairs. "I'm okay, Pa," she called out. "I just dropped the sack of potatoes on my foot, but I'm fine." Her father paused on the steps, his silhouette a heavy, unmoving block against the light from above. After a long, silent moment, long enough for Sadie to wonder if he knew she was lying, he grunted, turned, and climbed back up. Sadie leaned against the cool stone, clutching the potato sack, her heart finally slowing. She had clearly underestimated the Squonk. There was nowhere on the farm where he wouldn't find her. She had to find a way to be free from his soggy, wailing interruptions. The next afternoon, Sadie resolved to go to the forest as promised. She finished her chores early, wiped the kitchen clean, and even pinned the cameo brooch to her bodice, fully intending to head into the hemlock grove to get the creature's story over with once and for all. She was tired of the swampy smell and the tears that were trailing her. But as she stepped out to grab a final armful of kindling, she stopped cold. There he was, slumped across the woodpile. He had arranged himself in a heap of moldy, warty folds, leaning his heavy head against a log with the theatrical pose of a dying swan. He didn't even look up as she approached. He just let out a long, loud, bubbling sigh that sounded suspiciously like a deflating accordion. "Don't mind me, Sadie," he wheezed, throwing a webbed hand over his eyes. "I've decided to let myself evaporate here. It's quite all right. I'm clearly just a minor inconvenience compared to your potato counting schedule. I shall just dissolve into the woodpile, and you can go on your merry way, never having to be bothered by my ugliness or my story again." Sadie stared at the heap of warty, blubbering misery. Her patience, already stretched thin, snapped like a dry twig under a boot. "Oh, for heaven's sake, stop it!" Sadie shouted, her voice ringing out across the quiet yard. She marched right up to the woodpile and planted her hands on her hips, towering over him. "I was 5 minutes away from walking into those woods to find you, and here you are, acting all poor me on my woodpile." The squonk peeked through his webbed fingers, his eyes blinking with shock. You were coming?" he wheezed, his lower lip trembling. "Yes, I was coming." Sadie grabbed the nearest heavy log and slammed it onto the pile with a resounding thwack that made him jump. "I am tired of the dripping. I am tired of the sobbing, and I am certainly tired of you turning into a puddle at my feet. If you want to tell your story, you're going to tell it right here, right now, and you're going to do it without any more bawling." She pointed a finger directly at his warty chest. "No more puddles, no more drama. Start at the beginning, and if you cry so much as a single tear, I am going to use that bucket over there to bail you out of my yard." The squonk sat up, looking positively scandalized, yet strangely relieved. He sniffled, wiped his nose on his shoulder, and finally, for the first time, looked her directly in the eye. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his voice raspy and thin. "I was a man, Sadie, but I had a secret vanity. I loved my own face too well. That creek you love to wade in? I would sit there by the hour, staring into the water at my own reflection, rather than tending to what was needed around me. The mountain's magic tried to warn me, but I didn't see it. I only saw myself." He hung his head, his webbed fingers tracing one of his warts. "When the magic took hold, it didn't just take my shape. It punished my vanity. Now I can't bear for anyone to see me. I can't even bear the sight of myself. Every reflection I look at is a terrible reminder of how foolish I was. When I met you, I thought if I could look at someone as beautiful as you, even for just a few moments a day, I could forget my misery and pretend to be normal again." Sadie listened to his story and was able to see the squonk for what he really was, a creature so lonely that it made one's heart hurt. She didn't see a monster or a nuisance anymore. She saw a broken-hearted man trapped in a cage of his own making. Her frustration and annoyance dissolved into a deep, hollow ache of compassion. Without thinking, she stepped forward and pulled him into a firm, grounding hug. He stiffened, shocked by the contact. But as Sadie held her ground, he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her, letting out a long, quiet sigh that moved through his entire frame. For a brief, silent moment, Sadie realized that this was the one thing he had been starving for. The simple human comfort of being seen, not for the beauty he once craved, but for the man he still was. Then the change began. It wasn't a flash of lightning or a clap of thunder. It was as quiet as morning dew evaporating. The damp, swampy smell that had clung to him thinned. The warty, slimy skin, so heavy with his misery, began to pull tight, then soften, the unnatural ridges sinking back into the warmth of human flesh. Sadie stumbled back, her arms suddenly empty, as the heap of folds settled into a shape of a man. As he fell to the ground, he didn't dissolve into a puddle. Instead, he collapsed onto the grass, chest heaving, his fingers, human fingers, trembling as he reached up to touch his own face, feeling the jawline he had wasted so much time admiring. He looked up at her, his eyes clear and wide, stripped of the glassy, tear-filled haze of the Squonk. He looked terrified, bewildered, and for the first time, entirely real. "Can you walk?" Sadie asked, her voice steady despite the hammering in her own chest. He nodded once, gripping her arm for balance. I think so." Sadie led him to the blacksmith shop. They needed her father's help. When she pushed the heavy oak doors open, her father was at the anvil, the orange glow of the furnace casting long, dancing shadows against the soot-stained walls. He looked up, his brow furrowing, as he saw his daughter standing there with a gaunt, shivering stranger. "Sadie?" he rumbled, his voice dropping an octave in surprise. "Who have you brought here?" The young man took a step forward, and the blacksmith squinted, the orange firelight playing across the young man's face. The blacksmith's hammer slipped from his hand, clattering against the stone floor. "Elias?" The name hit the room with the force of an iron strike. The young man took a shaky step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't run away. I lost my way." The recognition was undeniable. This was Elias, his apprentice, the boy he had long ago dismissed as just an ungrateful youth who walked off when the work got hard. He had buried that memory deep with all the others he kept bandaged shut. Seeing him now gaunt and shivering was an intrusion he didn't know how to handle. "Your family," the blacksmith said, his voice gruff and steady. "They surely think you are dead. We need to get you home." Sadie and her father made short work of hitching the team to the wagon. As the blacksmith took the reins and the wagon began to rattle down the lane, the silence between them was heavy. Elias took a ragged, uncertain breath and began to speak. They deserved the truth about the vanity that had consumed him, and the long, terrible enchantment that had stolen his life. Elias spoke of the creek, his vanity, and the years of weeping that followed. The blacksmith listened, his hands white-knuckled on the reins, but as Elias described the soul-crushing exhaustion of constant sorrow, the blacksmith felt a strange, pressurized hunger. He remembered the raw, cleansing relief of a good, hard cry, a relief he had denied himself for decades. He found himself wishing he could remember how to produce a single, honest tear. Snap! The sound was like a gunshot echoing through the trees. The wagon lurched. Sadie grabbed the side rail. "Pa, the axle!" The blacksmith sat frozen, a trembling hand pressed over his heart. He let out a long, ragged exhale. "No," he said, his voice thick. "It wasn't the wagon." He looked at them, his eyes bright with tears. "It was the first band. I've held back tears for so long that they're finally demanding to be shed." A single, heavy tear escaped, carving a clean path through the soot on his cheek. As it fell, his rigid posture relaxed a bit, as if the weight had been uncoupled from his chest. Sadie, sensing the sorrowful shift in her father, decided to cut through the heavy air. "You know, Pa," she began, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth, "tears are one thing, but Elias here managed to turn misery into a full-time job. He was honestly just ridiculous." Elias, resting wearily against the bench, gave a small, defeated nod. "I suppose I was." Sadie turned to her father, her eyes dancing. "Oh, you should have seen him when he cornered me at the woodpile. I walk out to grab kindling, and there he is, slumped across the logs like he's posing for a funeral portrait." The blacksmith's eyebrows shot up. I'm standing there, Sadie continued, her voice rising in feigned disbelief, and he's practically whimpering. Oh, don't mind me, Sadie. I'll just lie here and melt away. Elias cut in. Well, what did you expect me to do? Your potato counting schedule kept getting in my way. Sadie chortled. I told him if he didn't stop acting like a dying swan, I was going to haul him out of my yard with the slop bucket. The blacksmith couldn't withstand the scene they painted, the absurdity of it, a tragic warty heap on a pile of kindling. Snap! The sound was sharp and bright, echoing through the trees like a cracking whip. The wagon pitched again while the blacksmith gasped, a hand flying to his chest. It was the second band, shattering against the weight of impending laughter. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and he let out a short, surprised bark that quickly deepened into a booming roar. He doubled over, clutching his sides, his laughter echoing through the trees like a joyous thunder. Wiping genuine tears of mirth, the blacksmith wheezed, Elias, you always were a terrible actor. The last echoes of their laughter faded as the wagon turned down the lane to the farm. When the team finally pulled to a halt before the cottage, the air grew still. Elias stepped down, his legs unsteady in the dust of the lane. A man returned from a void, waiting, poised between the hope of a welcome and the fear of what he might find. Recognition hit Elias's parents like a physical blow. His father moved first, his gait slow and disbelieving, his eyes searching Elias's face as if reading a long-lost letter. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched Elias's shoulder, then his face. Elias's mother collapsed into them. She let out a jagged sound, half sob and half laugh, as she pulled her son into the desperate, tight geometry of their embrace. There, in that farmyard, years of grief simply dissolved. Sadie and the blacksmith watched the scene unfold without making a sound. The blacksmith's hands dropped from the reins, his fingers finally loose. He watched the family, whole, reunited, and clinging to one another, a testament to a love that had refused to stay buried. Snap! The third and final band released from the blacksmith's heart. He finally understood that the world was not a place to be forged or controlled, but a place to be held. Slowly, his arm shifted, coming to rest around Sadie's shoulders. He pulled her close, anchoring himself to his daughter. He no longer felt the need to guard his heart. There was only the ache of being human, and for the first time, he was grateful for it. In the months that followed, Elias returned to the forge to complete his apprenticeship, fueled not by vanity, but by the steady human rhythm of honest work. Whenever the old, heavy melancholy threatened to return, it was Sadie's quick wit and ready laughter that acted as his anchor. And for the blacksmith, his heart was no longer a fortress. He moved through life tethered to his family and friends. Elias, Sadie, and the blacksmith all agreed that there was nothing compared to the grace of simply belonging.